All right, so I was on pause on porting this lower intake for a little bit um, because I wanted to stop. I hit a point on the number five runner, so the number five and number one are the most restrictive. I don't know exactly what the five flows, but I have seen the one flow at least 146, and then with a porting job opened up 100 CFM to like 246 in one example. And that's with the plenum on and everything. So obviously the throttle body tunnels and everything else are done on the plenum. But here's the thing: is I got stuck on this because I knew how to get to all of these portions on the roof, turning that into basically the definition of a shortcut. Um, and I know I showed those already, and I thought that was like the majority of it. But when I got to the five, for example, which I believe is lower, or excuse me, lesser of a port than this one as far as flow. At least visually, it just looks worse when you're looking inside. It's pretty bad, and it has a sensor. So, the sensor is not so obstructive. So I paused because what had happened is when I was looking at the port, like, okay, what else has to be done? My instinct was, and I've marked this with some Sharpie, was okay, make another shortcut here to straighten out the dogleg. Here's the thing about that: like, if you're not sure what a dogleg is, the only other time I've seen it used outside of talking about some intake runners is in Caddyshack 2, when Chevy Chase is playing a round of golf in his mansion, right? And like Jackie Mason's riding along with him because he's asking for help. Ty Webb is the character name, but he's in the mansion and he's in a golf cart going after this ball, and he hits this one section of hallway, and he's like, "Oops, watch the dog leg," or something about a dog leg. But basically, it's like a turn that's moving sideways. It's not something that probably you would see. Speaking of architecture, you probably wouldn't really see it a lot in modern architecture. Like, and I don't think people that don't know a lot about classical architecture that build McMansions are putting them in based on older designs. But anyway, so that's what it is. It's a turn that's moving sideways. I would say like a parallelogram is the best way to kind of sort of describe it, if that makes sense. But my first instinct was to take out some material on this inside, which I don't think quite as thick as this file, which is like what, like 30 thousandths or so, maybe 50. Um, but then I went on pause because I didn't want to, destroy the shape of the runner or kill too much velocity. So sometimes I have to, consult kind of the pros. Charlie Servetio has always been helpful with me, like on my E7s, just because I want to make sure I do this right. And I'm not in the business of porting. So I'm always thankful for people that are or have that much more experience to kind of help me to do this properly. Um, so anyway, so his answer kind of surprised me, and I'll show you why. So I have this blue water here to do this little demo, but there's a couple of fundamentals that you have to think about first of all. Is port flow, when you go on a flow bench, well, two things. That first of all, an engine makes vacuum, right? It's sucking air into the engine, and it's measured in inches of mercury. So you start out with 1 inch of mercury, or a square inch, and then however much force is pulling it is how it's measured, and it's usually within teens to 20s usually. Flow benches are typically measured at about 25 to 28. And then I forget how much like boost simulates or would add, like 14 psi's, but it's not important. On an NA, a typical engine is teens to 20s, maybe up to 29. I don't think it quite gets to 30. So if flow bench again is usually set to 25 or 28 inches of mercury. So that's something, first of all, that you have to consider, because instinctive physics, and I kind of thought about where this idea came from, but instinctively is your mind is always thinking of it with 1 inch of mercury. And where that comes from is I was thinking about it in this test, which is going to be very obvious, and you'll be like, "What?" Um, but I think it will illustrate something effectively. But I thought about the beach when you're a kid, right? And the waves come up, and you will dig kind of a pool, right? And then the objective is every time a wave comes up, it fills the pool, is you make a trench so that all of that water is rushing backwards. And the idea there is really in, well, however you're gonna measure it in feet per second or what have you, for that kind of volume and slower speed, or you could technically do CFM or CC. But anyway, so that's what I kind of came to realize, and that's why his answer was kind of surprising. And then I remembered, when you're on the intake side, you always have to have vacuum in your head. So things that you assume, uh, again, like maybe toward 1 inch of mercury, uh, kind of gets twisted a little, and it may not make perfect sense until you kind of really think about the physics behind it. Um, so, like when I'm doing exhaust, for example, when I'm porting on exhaust, is I'm always thinking of the exhaust pulses, right? And like, okay, this makes sense here, like what direction it's going. The intake side, and obviously this being the intake before the head, but is a little bit different because you have that constant vacuum, and it's a little different too because like with an exhaust, things like the temperature at your headers, like that's why I did internal ceramic coating on my headers and stuff like that. Like the hotter that you can keep that, the less restrictive and the faster it's going to pulse out of there. So there's a little different dynamics. But anyway, so what he had told me was, and you know what's funny is I feel like doing a little lab here. I feel like I should impersonate like Walter Lewin would be like, no, what do you think is going to happen at 1 inch of mercury? And then if we apply 28 inches of mercury, what do you think it wants to do at the apex? I don't know, that's probably pretty bad, but I don't know. If you don't know who Walter Lewin is, he's a great physicist, professor at MIT, great lecturer. Um, anyway, so what Charlie told me was adding area to the sharpest point, which in this case right below the port, um, and basically at the apex. Because again, my instinct wasn't wrong, but the last thing in my head was that this would have to be opened. And that was what he said. He said, oh, by area, what I mean is putting a bulge on the outside wall and then doing what you're doing kind of there with taking that down. And here's why this was confusing to me. All right, hopefully I can do this properly on camera. But watch this blue water and watch that outside wall. Look at that. It didn't even touch the inside, right? Obviously, and we're pretty level here. Like this is just mostly flat, obviously going into a catch. But if you look at the water line, there's some Sharpie there that's probably stopping it. But that was pretty obvious, right? And if you took any type of geology, like college level geology, it kind of makes you think of the dynamics and erosion of a creek or a river, right? Like something that meanders is going to erode differently. A flatter plane, it's going to spread out in the embankments. Like some of the largest rivers have insane bends, like the Mississippi, for example, almost does like 90-degree to 180-degree turns, and it's very slow. Whereas if you go to the St. Lawrence, for example, very straight, and that's because parts of the St. Lawrence are like 100 feet deep at the channel and stuff like that. It's also crystal clear. St. Lawrence is amazing. I haven't been there in years, but anyway. So when you start to think about that, it becomes obvious that you also think of I would say the best example would be like a water slide where that makes sense to you, or a roller coaster, like, oh yeah, that embankment should be there. You shouldn't cut anything there because that's speed, right? So that's what you're kind of instinctively thinking of. And again, notice how the inside wall is doing nothing. Um, so it's kind of funny how, without showing a physical property of something, and obviously water has a completely different inertial mass. The weight of it and gravity is somewhat simulating vacuum, but not totally. And I can't really hook up the shop vac to show how it would suck water up, and a vacuum would be about 20 inches of mercury. But obviously, water being heavier than air, and it's not proper. The best way, you know what you could do it with, if you had like a fog machine or smoke, probably would be the best way to illustrate it, like a little smoker with a line, like kind of like a wind tunnel. So it's just interesting to note, right? So you assume, oh yeah, I'll take this away because, you know, it's opening up airflow. But the reality is, um, you're thinking about velocity and not the sheer mass of air, or the fact that you're going to slow the runner down anyway when you're doing porting. And yes, like velocity equals good low end torque value. Like obviously a long runner plenum like this is going to make more torque, and that's why they put these on the trucks. Um, but it's just funny. You think, like I said, a water slide, being on a raft. Okay, you need that embankment. If that embankment wasn't there, you're not going to build up enough speed to get around. So I was confused by it at first, but here's what I came to realize: is that assumption is based again on just gravity, whatever the mass of the object, an inertial mass coming around that turn. And then what I realized was, because of vacuum, the more important thing by opening up area here in this pinch is that you're just making more air available. And that's basically how a plenum works, right? Like the bigger the plenum, obviously, again, with the truck, it has a massive plenum, so it helps create velocity. But typically, performance plenums are just overall going to have more air available. Um, so that's kind of why that didn't make sense to me originally. So that's the whole thing with porting, is you have to have those fundamentals to realize your mind's not necessarily thinking of this being a vacuum. Maybe it is, maybe I'm an idiot, but uh, that's kind of why I illustrated that, and realized when I watched that oh, like I'm thinking of my velocity and not just the outright flow potential. Because opening up the apex, like you wouldn't want to open it too far there, but opening it within where that those black markings are, is, even though it's a dog leg and it's moving sideways, is there's just that much more area available for air to be pulled through the plenum. So pretty interesting. Again, maybe it seems obvious, but that's kind of how people end up making mistakes. And a lot of times when I see engines online, um, and they say, oh, it was ported, like I'll look at similar builds, and it'll say, oh, the E7s were mildly ported, or the intake was ported. And even with me thinking, oh, I'm fully in the know now, I've seen what professionals do, is I'm glad that I paused and asked that question to realize, you know, oh, to really fully truly do these, you still have to work on that bend. And obviously you're leaving, the actual port openings are quite large and perfectly fine. Like this is identical to the Holley Systemax intake, which is like, I mean, the runners I believe are straight, but the ports are the same. So that's why you can get phenolic spacers that are designed for the trick that are, well, they're Trickflow brand, but they're designed for Holley. So that was cool. But in the end, I realized I probably don't want to extend the runners, because this thing is already potentially falling off at 5,000 RPM. I thought opening it up, obviously, with more CFM will extend the RPM, but having, you know, more length and stuff is probably going to bring the low end down. So, plus not fitting in the van, but I do have like a 1-inch phenolic spacer for this, and then a throttle body spacer. So I don't know. It's not like I couldn't experiment, but it would be very like butt dyno based, maybe with a gyro sensor in my phone. And that's what's cool about smartphones, is you don't have to get like a G-Tech anymore. Um, But you can see those inside walls are the same in each. It's just extreme in the 5 because it goes here. Look at it from the top down. Like, okay, it's an S turn almost, basically. And then number 1 is like half an S turn. But anyway, so I don't know. I thought I would share that. So if anyone else is doing your truck lower, like, I believe in kind of free education with stuff that you can find in a junkyard, obviously. Um, and again, the numbers I've seen, like mid 200s, are on par with the trick flow street heats and stuff. Like, obviously, a carb is going to flow better, but the advantage of a truck and sticking to EFI is the low end power is better. So, um, but CFM wise, with what's available, I mean, that's over 400 horsepower that you could build, depending on your heads and cam, but that's the potential of flow like that. So especially if you're on a 331, 347, 351, etc. Uh, but yeah, so I'm paused on that, and I had to order new carbides because or new burrs because I realized I'm gonna need a spherical, and 90% of the work on this I've used this ball nose. I take the 6-inch extended quarter-inch, and I cut them down to 4-inch so they're a little more manageable. But what sucks, I broke this while it broke itself. I don't know what you call this in plumbing. They're like, I'm sure a plumber would know, but see how that popped out? What happened was this fell off the bench, and the weight of it pulled it out. So I have to put a hand on this and hold it into place in this. So I can no longer have two hands on this. So I basically am porting with one hand. So I almost got 1/8-inch single cut. And by the way, if you're doing aluminum, if you don't know, you use single cuts. I have cut aluminum with a double cut, but it'll eat up your burr. Actually, the whole plenum I did with an 1/8-inch double cut that looked like these, and it didn't totally ruin it, but see the difference. But I was going to get little 1/8-inch aluminum ones and do detail work, but I was like, you know what, I want to get this done quick. So those should be here in a couple of days, and I can get going on that. But yes, I'm glad that I asked him, so thank you, Charlie, for that. But now I'm also confident that everything I've done is like kind of what the people do. Like, you could like cut this out completely and actually weld aluminum, obviously. I've seen forms made and still used with JB Weld, and obviously you can see it there, a little shine. I don't know, hopefully I'm using the right ratio, and I am going to put another layer on this. Actually, I have to probably use some rubbing alcohol, because now that I've like touched this, and so I'll have to clean that. But here's the aluminum shavings that I put in this, and those are luckily small holes, like they're half the size of that bolt hole there. So but yeah, now I feel a lot better. I feel, as much as I'd love to get this flowed, like, it's aluminum, it wouldn't be that expensive to ship out to someone and just have them put it would be really cool to see the kind of fruits of my labor. But um I think now that I know that and have the right ideas, I probably would feel pretty confident once the engine's running, and then it's going to be seat of your pants, and maybe doing electronics like with the phone to dyno it on the road. But because I don't even think we have real dynos around here, so we'll see. But I do at least have my chip for speed density. I had a custom chipped burn based on all the things I had done and planned to, so hopefully that should be pretty good, and I can work with them if worst case scenario. But it's really just going to be about having the timing right, 180-degree thermostat, but it's dialed in for our injectors and everything like that. So anyway, so that's all for now, but it's just something to think about if you are a porter, is always remember that you're under that much more vacuum than gravity alone. And even if it seems obvious or the right thing to do, is that may have made a huge difference there if I didn't know to open that corner up. I don't know how many CFM, but I'm sure that is significant, at least for correcting that turn to flow maximum. So anyway, I think that's all, and I'll see you later.